There was a moment when people in Washington thought they understood exactly how this story would unfold. They had seen the pattern before. A threat appears. Pressure begins to build. Headlines start moving faster than facts. Markets become nervous. Politicians become cautious. And somewhere in the middle of all that uncertainty, the person on the receiving end starts making concessions. It was a familiar cycle, a cycle that had worked more than once. And when Donald Trump began turning his attention toward Canada again, many people assumed the ending had already been written, because Trump had always understood something that few politicians truly mastered. Power is not just about what you can do. Power is about what people believe you might do. The possibility, the uncertainty, the fear. Sometimes the threat itself becomes more powerful than the action. And when that pressure starts building, most leaders react. Some become defensive, some become emotional. Some rush to reassure everyone around them that everything is under control. But then something happened that nobody expected. Mark Carney didn't seem interested in reacting. He didn't appear eager to fight. He didn't seem interested in trading insults. He didn't rush toward the cameras. He didn't respond with outrage. Instead, he did something that slowly began making Washington uncomfortable. He stayed calm. At first, that calm looked ordinary, then it started looking deliberate, and eventually it started looking dangerous, because while everyone was watching the pressure campaign unfold in public, Carney appeared to be focused on something else entirely: preparation, positioning, patience. The kind of patience that only exists when someone believes they have more options than everyone else realizes. And that's when people started asking a different question. What if Trump wasn't walking Canada into a trap? What if Canada had already anticipated the pressure long before it arrived? Because if that were true, then everything people thought they understood about this confrontation might be wrong, and what happened next would leave Washington trying to figure out who was really controlling the game. Section 1. The first signs were easy to miss. In fact, most people missed them completely, because when political conflict begins, attention naturally moves toward the loudest voice in the room. And Donald Trump has never had difficulty becoming the loudest voice in the room. For years, his political style relied on something remarkably effective: control the conversation before anyone else can. Set the terms, set the tempo, force everyone else to react. Whether people agreed with him or opposed him almost didn't matter. As long as they were responding, they were playing inside a framework he helped create. That strategy had shaped countless political battles. It had shaped negotiations, campaigns, international disputes, business conflicts. The formula was simple: create pressure, increase uncertainty, force movement, then capitalize on the reaction. And when discussions involving Canada started becoming increasingly tense, many observers assumed the same formula would play out once again. Why wouldn't it? The economic relationship between the United States and Canada remains one of the most interconnected relationships in the world. Supply chains cross borders. Energy flows in both directions. Manufacturing systems depend on cooperation. Entire industries are linked together through decades of integration. Everyone understood that reality. Trump understood it. Washington understood it. Ottawa understood it, which is exactly why public pressure carried so much weight. Because leverage often comes from dependence. The more someone needs something from you, the more influence you potentially possess, at least in theory. And theory is where things started becoming complicated, because beneath the headlines, something appeared to be changing. Not dramatically, not overnight, but gradually. The kind of change that doesn't attract attention until it's already well underway. While political observers focused on public statements, discussions about economic diversification continued receiving attention inside policy circles. Alternative partnerships, expanded trade relationships, new investment opportunities, different markets, different routes, different options. None of it looked dramatic on television. Most people would probably find the subject boring, but boring developments often create the biggest long-term consequences, because power doesn't always change during dramatic moments. Sometimes it changes quietly, one decision at a time, one agreement at a time, one new relationship at a time. And the more those relationships expand, the more flexibility a country gains. Flexibility matters, because flexibility creates choices, and choices reduce vulnerability. That principle would become increasingly important as pressure continued building. Meanwhile, Trump remained exactly what everyone expected him to be: direct, aggressive, confident, willing to apply public pressure, willing to challenge assumptions, willing to force uncomfortable conversations. Supporters viewed this as strength, critics viewed it as disruption, but regardless of perspective, one fact remained undeniable. Trump understood how to command attention, and attention itself can become a form of leverage, because once attention arrives, expectations follow. People begin waiting for reactions, waiting for responses, waiting for someone to blink first. That's where the psychological game begins. And Washington expected Canada to blink. Many people assumed it was only a matter of time. The pressure would increase, the headlines would multiply, the uncertainty would grow. Eventually, someone would respond emotionally. Eventually, someone would make a mistake. That is usually how these stories unfold, except this story wasn't following the usual script, because Mark Carney appeared determined to operate according to a different timeline, a slower timeline, a quieter timeline, a timeline that wasn't being dictated by headlines. And that created a problem. The problem wasn't what Carney was saying. The problem was what he wasn't saying. He wasn't escalating. He wasn't attacking. He wasn't providing dramatic responses that could dominate the next news cycle. Instead, he projected something far more difficult to interpret: control. And control can be unsettling, especially when pressure is designed to create the opposite. Think about it. If someone expects panic and receives calm instead, uncertainty changes direction. Suddenly, the person applying pressure starts wondering whether something has been overlooked, whether assumptions were incorrect, whether the other side knows something they don't. That uncertainty slowly began spreading through political conversations, not publicly, not dramatically, but quietly. Because the longer Carney remained composed, the harder it became to fit the situation into a familiar pattern. The confrontation was supposed to produce visible reactions. Instead, it was producing questions. Questions about Canada's long-term strategy, questions about economic resilience, questions about whether years of preparation had created more flexibility than outsiders realized, and if those questions had answers, they might fundamentally alter the balance of the entire confrontation, because pressure works best against people who believe they have nowhere else to go. But what happens when the person you're pressuring has already started building alternatives? What happens when every threat simply reinforces their motivation to keep building them? That possibility was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. And before long, Washington would discover that the real story wasn't about the pressure itself. It was about what the pressure was creating. And that realization was about to change everything. The strange thing about pressure is that people often assume it produces immediate results. They imagine a direct line between action and reaction. One threat, one response, one winner, one loser. But real power rarely works that way. Real power reveals itself over time. And by the time most people recognize a shift, the shift has already happened. That is what made this situation so difficult to read. Because while headlines continued focusing on political confrontation, something else appeared to be unfolding beneath the surface. A slower battle, a quieter battle, a battle over leverage itself. And leverage is a dangerous thing to lose, especially when your entire strategy depends on it. As tensions continued attracting attention, Trump remained committed to a familiar approach. Keep the pressure visible. Keep the conversation moving. Keep uncertainty alive, because uncertainty has a way of changing behavior. Businesses become cautious, investors become nervous, political leaders begin calculating risks. The mere possibility of disruption can influence decisions long before anything actually happens. Trump understood that. He always had. The possibility of consequences often carries power of its own, and for years that reality had worked in his favor. But this time there was an unexpected complication. Canada wasn't behaving like a country trapped by uncertainty. If anything, it seemed increasingly focused on reducing uncertainty altogether, not through dramatic announcements, not through emotional speeches, but through preparation. And preparation creates confidence. The more prepared someone becomes, the less effective intimidation tends to be. Because intimidation depends on doubt. It depends on fear. It depends on convincing someone that the future belongs to the person applying pressure. But what happens when that belief starts disappearing? That question was becoming harder to avoid, especially as conversations surrounding diversification continued gaining momentum. The concept itself wasn't new. Countries have always sought additional trade relationships, additional markets, additional opportunities, additional flexibility. But under pressure, those efforts begin taking on a different meaning. Suddenly, diversification isn't just economic policy. It becomes insurance. Insurance against uncertainty, insurance against dependence, insurance against future vulnerability, and insurance changes behavior. People who feel protected make different decisions than people who feel exposed. That distinction would become increasingly important because every new round of pressure appeared to strengthen the very argument Carney was making. The argument that Canada needed options, more options. Stronger options, long-term options. Think about the irony for a moment. The more uncertainty entered the conversation, the easier it became to justify building alternatives. The more pressure increased, the stronger the political case for resilience became, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dynamic started shifting. Not publicly, not dramatically, psychologically. The confrontation was no longer just about pressure, it was becoming about adaptation. And adaptation is difficult to stop once it begins, because adaptation changes incentives. People stop asking how to survive the current challenge, they start asking how to avoid the next one. That change in thinking can be transformative. It moves the conversation away from reaction and toward strategy, away from urgency and toward planning, away from fear and toward preparation. And preparation was becoming the defining feature of Carney's approach. The contrast between the two styles could not have been clearer. Trump operated in public. Carney appeared to be operating in the future. Trump focused on today's pressure. Carney seemed focused on tomorrow's position. Neither approach was accidental. Neither approach was random. Both men appeared to understand exactly what they were trying to accomplish, but only one of them seemed interested in slowing the pace of the confrontation. And that mattered, because speed is often a weapon. The faster events move, the harder it becomes for people to think clearly. Mistakes multiply, emotions rise, decisions become reactive. Trump's political style has often benefited from speed, rapid headlines, rapid responses, rapid escalation. The environment itself becomes part of the strategy. But Carney wasn't accelerating, he was slowing things down. And slowing things down can be surprisingly powerful, because once momentum disappears, people start examining fundamentals, they start asking deeper questions, questions about long-term interests, questions about structural vulnerabilities, questions about what happens 5 years from now instead of 5 days from now. Those questions tend to produce very different answers. And some of those answers were making people in Washington increasingly uncomfortable. Because the longer the confrontation continued, the more attention shifted toward dependency itself. How dependent was Canada? How dependent was the United States? Who actually needed whom more? Those questions sound simple, but they rarely are. Economic relationships are complicated. Supply chains are complicated. Energy systems are complicated. Modern economies are interconnected in ways that are often invisible until disruption occurs, which meant one assumption was becoming less certain. The assumption that pressure would automatically produce compliance, because compliance depends on incentives, and incentives change when alternatives emerge. That realization slowly began altering the conversation. At first, only a few people seemed to notice, then more people noticed, then suddenly everyone noticed. Something wasn't unfolding according to the usual pattern. The panic wasn't appearing, the concessions weren't appearing, the urgency wasn't appearing, and when expected reactions fail to materialize, pressure campaigns become more difficult to evaluate. How do you measure success when the other side refuses to behave as expected? How do you create momentum when someone keeps slowing the pace? How do you dominate a confrontation when your opponent refuses to enter the arena you've prepared for them? Those questions became increasingly important. Then came one of the most revealing moments of the entire episode. A reporter raised the issue directly. The comments, the rhetoric, the escalating tension, the public pressure. The room understood exactly what was being asked. Would Carney finally engage emotionally? Would he respond in kind? Would he abandon restraint and step into a public fight? Many leaders would have. Many leaders do. After all, politics rewards conflict. Conflict generates attention. Attention generates headlines. Headlines generate momentum. The incentives are obvious. Yet Carney once again appeared unwilling to follow the expected script. No visible frustration, no visible anger, no visible urgency, just composure, steady, measured, deliberate. And something fascinating happened in that moment. The absence of emotion became the story, not because it was dramatic, but because it was unusual. People expect calm during easy moments. They do not expect calm during pressure, especially sustained pressure. That distinction matters, because calm under pressure communicates something. It communicates confidence, preparation, conviction. Whether justified or not, that perception has power. And perception influences politics just as much as reality, perhaps more. Which meant every calm appearance reinforced the same message. Canada was not behaving like a country on the verge of panic. Canada was behaving like a country preparing for the long game, and long games create problems for short-term pressure. Because every day that passes without a breakthrough raises new questions. Every week that passes without visible movement changes expectations. Every month that passes gives preparation more time to work. By now, the confrontation was no longer just attracting attention. It was creating doubt. Not doubt in Canada's position, doubt in the assumptions that had existed at the beginning, assumptions about leverage, assumptions about dependence, assumptions about who controlled the pace. And once those assumptions begin cracking, the entire structure starts looking different. What initially appeared to be a straightforward pressure campaign was beginning to resemble something else entirely. A contest of patience, a contest of preparation, a contest over who could endure uncertainty longer. And if that was the real contest, Washington was about to discover that Carney had been preparing for it from the very beginning. Because the next phase of this story wouldn't be about what Trump said. It would be about what Canada quietly started doing, and that is where the balance of power began shifting in ways almost nobody saw coming. By the time most people realized something had changed, the change had already happened. That is often how major shifts unfold, not with a dramatic announcement, not with a single headline, not with one decisive moment that everyone immediately recognizes. Instead, the ground moves slowly beneath everyone's feet, and only later do people look back and realize they were standing in a completely different place. That seemed to be exactly what was happening here, because while attention remained fixed on public statements and political theater, the real story was becoming harder to ignore. Canada wasn't simply enduring pressure. Canada appeared to be adapting to it. And adaptation creates consequences. The longer it continues, the more permanent those consequences become. That was the uncomfortable reality beginning to emerge. Every warning, every threat, every new round of uncertainty, each one appeared to reinforce the same conclusion. The future could not rely on a single source of stability, not completely, not indefinitely, and once that conclusion takes hold, behavior starts changing. Governments adjust priorities, businesses explore alternatives, investors reassess risks, entire institutions begin thinking differently. The process is gradual, almost invisible at first, but eventually gradual changes become structural changes, and structural changes are difficult to reverse. That possibility was now sitting at the center of the confrontation, because what if the pressure itself was accelerating the very outcome it was supposed to prevent? What if every escalation simply encouraged more diversification, more resilience, more preparation, more independence, not total independence? That was never the point. The United States and Canada would remain deeply connected. Economically, geographically, strategically, the relationship was too important and too integrated for anything else. But dependency and partnership are not the same thing. Partnership creates cooperation, dependency creates vulnerability, and reducing vulnerability appeared to be one of Carney's central objectives. Suddenly, his behavior started making far more sense. The calm, the patience, the refusal to engage emotionally, the absence of panic. It wasn't necessarily about avoiding conflict. It was about avoiding distraction, because distractions consume attention, and attention is finite. Every minute spent fighting yesterday's battle is a minute not spent preparing for tomorrow's. Carney appeared to understand that, which may explain why he kept refusing invitations to participate in the kind of public confrontation many people expected. He wasn't trying to win the news cycle. He appeared to be focused on something much larger, positioning Canada for a future where uncertainty carried less influence, and that is where the psychology of the entire situation became fascinating, because pressure campaigns usually depend on one critical assumption, the assumption that the future will look roughly like the past, that existing relationships will remain unchanged, that existing dependencies will remain intact, that existing leverage will continue functioning exactly as it always has. But what happens when those assumptions stop being true? Everything changes, the calculation changes, the incentives change, the balance of power changes, and perhaps most importantly, expectations change. Washington had expected urgency. Instead, it encountered patience. Washington had expected reaction. Instead, it encountered restraint. Washington had expected visible pressure points. Instead, it encountered a leader who seemed increasingly comfortable operating without immediate validation. That created a strategic dilemma, because pressure works best when people fear uncertainty. Yet Carney appeared determined to normalize uncertainty, to accept it, to plan around it, to reduce its influence. And once uncertainty loses its power, leverage begins losing its power too. That realization was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The confrontation had started as a test of pressure. It was becoming a test of endurance. Who could sustain their approach longer? Who could remain committed to their strategy? Who would eventually force the other side to adjust? Those questions no longer had obvious answers, and that alone represented a significant shift, because at the beginning, many people believed they already knew how the story would end. Now they weren't so sure. The certainty had disappeared, and certainty is often the first casualty when power starts moving. Perhaps that is why the final stage of the story felt so different from the beginning. The atmosphere had changed, the assumptions had changed, even the conversation had changed. People were no longer asking whether pressure existed. Everyone could see the pressure. The question had become whether the pressure was producing its intended result. And increasingly, the answer seemed less obvious than before, because while pressure continued attracting headlines, Canada continued discussing resilience. While pressure focused on immediate outcomes, Canada focused on long-term positioning. While pressure demanded reactions, Canada focused on preparation. Two completely different timelines, two completely different philosophies, two completely different definitions of victory, and somewhere inside that contrast lay the real lesson of the entire episode. The lesson wasn't about who issued the stronger statement. It wasn't about who generated the bigger headline. It wasn't even about who controlled a particular news cycle. Those moments pass, headlines fade, political arguments come and go. The deeper lesson was about leverage, how it is created, how it is maintained, and how it can slowly disappear when circumstances change, because leverage is never permanent. No country's leverage is permanent. No politician's leverage is permanent. No strategy remains effective forever. Conditions evolve, relationships evolve, incentives evolve, and leaders who recognize those changes early often gain advantages that remain invisible until much later. That is what made Carney's response so unusual. He did not appear interested in fighting the pressure directly. He appeared interested in reducing the importance of the pressure altogether, and those are very different goals. One approach focuses on winning today's argument. The other focuses on changing tomorrow's environment. By the end, that distinction had become impossible to ignore. Trump expected a fight, a public confrontation, a visible struggle, the kind of conflict that dominates headlines and forces immediate reactions. Instead, he encountered something far more difficult to predict: patience, discipline, preparation, a response that refused to follow the expected script, a response that transformed pressure into motivation, a response that turned uncertainty into justification for long-term change. And whether people supported one side or the other, one reality stood out above everything else. The confrontation did not unfold the way many expected. The reactions never arrived, the panic never arrived, the urgency never arrived. Instead, the pressure met resistance of a different kind. Not loud resistance, not emotional resistance, quiet resistance, strategic resistance, the kind that operates beneath the headlines, the kind that grows stronger over time, the kind that makes opponents wonder whether they are still playing the same game they started, and that may be the most remarkable part of the entire story. Because in Washington, many expected Canada to bend. Many expected Canada to blink. Many expected Canada to react. But Mark Carney chose a different path. He stayed calm. He stayed patient. And in doing so, he forced everyone watching to confront a possibility they had not fully considered. What if the strongest response to pressure isn't pressure at all? What if the strongest response is becoming less vulnerable to it? And once that question entered the conversation, the balance of the entire confrontation began to look very different. Perhaps that is why this story continues to attract attention, not because it was loud, but because it was quiet, not because it followed a familiar pattern, but because it broke one. And sometimes the most consequential political moves are the ones that barely look like moves at all.